I assume everyone knows what nephrology is. Kidneys. So, and that's my story. So when I was 12 years old, I'm looking at this audience, probably when I'm talking about, none of you were born. And I'll even give you the real year. It was 1963. I was watching a television program, and it was Discovery 63. And I was a kid sitting on the floor, kind of not really paying attention. And then suddenly they started talking about this fascinating thing. They said that someone, somewhere, had taken chimpanzee kidneys and given it to a human being. So you have to understand 1963. So in 1963, routine dialysis was not available. If you wanted dialysis, you collected cans and you got friends and you did all sorts of funny things to pay for your dialysis. So the diagnosis of end-stage kidney disease was a death sentence during those periods. Also, for people who had acute kidney injury, suddenly happens, kidneys can get better. If it got better, you're okay quickly enough. If it didn't get better quickly enough, you were dead. So that's the setting in which we're talking about. So there, everyone was exploring. So how do we do this? No, there was dialysis, but it wasn't being paid for. That only happened in 1973. And so mercifully it happened in 73, and I guarantee you there will never be end-stage renal care for another organ because it's too costly. Liver, there are more people dying of liver disease than with kidney disease. And kidney disease is almost breaking the bank. So I'm this little kid sitting on the floor, and they say, well, you know, someone put chimpanzee kidneys into a human. I couldn't help myself. For 2 weeks, I could think of nothing else but that. I mean, literally, I was walking around and I'd look at television and I'd draw pictures. I couldn't forget it. And so, you know, I kind of moved on as a 12-year-old. I made it into high school, and I liked science. So my real story, my beginning of science starts with the atom, right? I'm sure it started with everybody in this room. I saw this thing, this tiny little thing that makes up everything, the atom. And again, I would walk around, I was about 8 at that point. I walked around and I touched things. You mean things are composed of these atoms? I couldn't quite believe it. And so I was fascinated by this sort of work. I thought, okay, I should become a basic scientist. I knew nothing about basic science. So I had the opportunity to work with organic chemists in high school. I was an explorer, one of the early explorers where you actually got to go into the hospital and see open heart surgery. I kind of like that stuff a lot. And I like the idea of helping people sort of get better. So I went to medical school. The choices were psychology versus medical school. I picked medical school, happy I made the choice. And then I had to decide, okay, what do you do when you're finished with medical school? And I thought becoming an internal medicine doctor was the way to do it. Not a primary care doc. I started with the idea that I was going to specialize, and I was aiming towards this kidney again. It followed me everywhere I went. And so I got to the point I had to decide. I became a nephrology fellow, someone training in kidney diseases. And during that time, there wasn't a lot of easy research that we were doing. So we were just getting to the point where we're doing studies at the cellular level. I wanted to do cell culture work. That's another story. It's a fascinating story. They made a movie about this guy. He went to jail. He murdered someone. I'm just saying. This is a true story. I was that tough. I went across the street. I wanted to work with him. He murdered someone. So I didn't get to work. So I became a fellow, and I started doing research. So the first research I was involved in was metabolic studies. I worked in a metabolic chamber, And if you're a renal fellow, your job as the renal fellow is to clean up dog poop. And I was excellent at that. So I cleaned up dog poop, and we looked at the balance in the animals to make sure what we put in came out, and we knew it. So I did all of that. I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And so I did some cell culture work, but then this idea of sort of helping people got stronger and stronger. By that time, dialysis was being paid for by the government, so there were dialysis units and so forth. And I took care of these people, and they just didn't seem to be going anywhere. They were sick, and they got sicker and sicker and sicker. And I came back to the transplant idea again. So I started taking care of transplant patients. And so I was in Boston at Tufts, and finally decided I'd go to Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh was a place where, not much transplant was going on, but suddenly this guy, Thomas Starzl, I hope some of you know him. He's the one who did the first successful liver transplant. He also is the one who made kidney transplants work by simply combining two medications. Big figure. He came to Pittsburgh. When I was working there, then other nephrologists fought it out with him. They couldn't work with him. They were screaming and calling each other names in the hall. This is not a joke. I won't tell you the words they use because there are children in the audience. And so no one could work with them, but I could. And so I sort of started to work with the surgeons, and I'm working with the medical docs, and then there was this new drug that we were going to probably start to use. It was called FK506. Anyone medical people probably know it. It's just right off the top of your head. There had been another drug called cyclosporin that had revolutionized kidney transplantation. So patients in graft survival, 80% for graft, 90+% for patient. Big deal, except that there are a lot of side effects to it, and it still wasn't quite good enough. And so I started working with the new drug, the FK506. That's where the baboon comes in again. So we found that this drug is very potent. It can prevent rejection. We hope that maybe it could prevent rejection between species. So transplant between species is very, very, very hard to do. So we are dealing with something like innate immunity. So it's not acquired immunity where you see something, you form antibodies against it, you get memory, the next time you see it, you kill it. This you kill anything because it's very basic immunology, innate immunology. That's what we're dealing with when we deal with xenotransplants. So we transplanted two patients, two men. One had hepatitis B, one had HIV back before treatment for HIV. And we hoped that actually this drug would help cure HIV. That's one of the reasons we did it. It didn't. Those patients lived for about 6 weeks, which was the longest that any patients had lived with a xenotransplant. And after that, people said, well, look, this is probably going to be the future. We're going to start having animals, we're going to get baboons, and then we're going to do transplants. And they were at one of the meetings, they said, well, when do you think this is going to happen? And people were saying, 5 years, 10 years. I said we were the last ones to do it. That was 1992 and 93. And no one else has even tried it since then. It's not going to be the answer. And so when we did the baboon liver transplants, I went into the operating room when the baboon was on the table, and I will tell you it was an eerie experience because this animal was lying back with his arms back, and he looked quite human to me. And that was disturbing for me. And then I went to the animal lab, and we had baboons and other primates in there, and you look at their eyes and there's a spark of something that's very troubling. And I said, this is probably not okay. And most people thought, well, there are not enough primates, we should be using pig. And so in Pittsburgh in those days, we started research programs, how you can knock out molecules. So we knocked out one molecule, did the transplants using the pig, still rejected. Knocked out another one, 2 knockouts, still rejected. 3 knockouts, still rejected. So using the pig is probably not going to be the idea either. So what's going to be the answer for transplants? I think it's going to be we'll be growing our own kidneys. And as a nephrologist, if I see my patients in the clinic, I say, look, you've got kidney disease. We're going to probably need to have you on dialysis, but let me get this little puncher, and I'm going to take a little punch of your skin. We're going to send this to the lab, and using technology like CRISPR, this is a scientific group. I'm not going to try to explain it to you because it's out of my area. But using that kind of technology, we will likely be able to grow kidneys from you. And if you have a gene that's a problem, we'll be able to get rid of that gene and insert something there that works better for you. That's the future. So I started with xenotransplant, I started with animal transplantation. Fundamentally, there's something wrong with that. Okay, I feel that right in here. Growing your own kidneys is the way to do it. And I think we will have the technology for that before we're able to do xenotransplants. And that's all I have to say.